This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information and to find out how to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 3 Short Works by Gustave Flaubert. A Simple Soul. Chapter 4. The Bird. He was called Lulu. His body was green, his head blue, the tips of his wings were pink, and his breast was golden. But he had the tiresome tricks of biting his perch, pulling his feathers out, scattering refuse, and spilling the water of his bath. Madame Aubin grew tired of him and gave him to Félicité for good. She undertook his education, and soon he was able to repeat, "Pretty boy, your servant, sir, I salute you, Marie." His perch was placed near the door, and several persons were astonished that he didn't answer to the name of Jacot, for every parrot is called Jacot. They called him a goose and a log, and these taunts were like so many dagger thrusts to Félicité. Strange stubbornness of the bird, which would not talk when people watched him. Nevertheless, he sought society. For on Sunday, when the ladies Rochefeuille, Monsieur de Houppeville, and the new habitués Onfroy, the chemist, Monsieur Varin, and Captain Mathieu dropped in for their game of cards, he struck the window panes with his wings, and made such a racket that it was impossible to talk. Bouret's face must have appeared very funny to Lulu. As soon as he saw him, he would begin to roar. His voice re-echoed in the yard, and the neighbours would come to the windows and begin to laugh too. And in order that the parrot might not see him, Monsieur Bouret edged along the wall, pushed his hat over his eyes to hide his profile, and entered by the garden door. And the looks he gave the bird lacked affection. Lulu, having thrust his head into the butcher boy's basket, received a slap, and from that time he always tried to nip his enemy. Fabu threatened to wring his neck, although he was not cruelly inclined, notwithstanding his big whiskers and tattooings. On the contrary, he rather liked the bird, and out of deviltry tried to teach him oaths. Félicité, whom his manner alarmed, put Lulu in the kitchen, took off his chain, and let him walk all over the house. When he went downstairs, he rested his beak on the steps, lifted his right foot and then his left one. But his mistress feared that such feats would give him vertigo. He became ill and was unable to eat. There was a small growth under his tongue, like those chickens are sometimes afflicted with. Félicité pulled it off with her nails and cured him. One day, Paul was imprudent enough to blow the smoke of his cigar in his face. Another time, Madame Lormeau was teasing him with the tip of her umbrella, and he swallowed the tip. Finally, he got lost. She had put him on the grass to cool him, and went away only for a second. When she returned, she found no parrot. She hunted among the bushes, on the bank of the river, and on the roofs, without paying any attention to Madame Aubin, who screamed at her, "Take care, you must be insane!" Then she searched every garden in Pont-l'Évêque, and stopped the passers-by to inquire of them, "Haven't you perhaps seen my parrot?" To those who'd never seen the parrot, she described him minutely. Suddenly she thought she saw something green fluttering behind the mills at the foot of the hill. But when she was at the top of the hill, she couldn't see it. A hod-carrier told her that he had just seen the bird in Saint-Malin, in Mother Simon's store. She rushed to the place. The people did not know what she was talking about. At last she came home, exhausted, with her slippers worn to shreds and despair in her heart. She sat down on the bench near Madame, and was telling of her search, when presently a light weight dropped on her shoulder. Lulu! What the deuce had he been doing? Perhaps he'd just taken a little walk around the town. She did not easily forget her scare. In fact, she never got over it. In consequence of a cold, she caught a sore throat, and some time afterwards she had an earache. 3 years later, she was stone deaf and spoke in a very loud voice even in church. Although her sins might have been proclaimed throughout the diocese without any shame to herself or ill effects to the community, the curé thought it advisable to receive her confession in the vestry room. Imaginary buzzings also added to her bewilderment. Her mistress often said to her, "My goodness, how stupid you are!" And she would answer, "Yes, madame," and look for something. The narrow circle of her ideas grew more restricted than it already was. The bellowing of the oxen, the chime of the bells no longer reached her intelligence. All things moved silently, like ghosts. Only one noise penetrated her ears, the parrot's voice. As if to divert her mind, he reproduced for her the tic-tac of the spit in the kitchen, the shrill cry of the fish vendors, the saw of the carpenter who had a shop opposite, and when the doorbell rang, he would imitate Madame Aubin. "Félicité, go to the front door!" They held conversations together, Loulou repeating the 3 phrases of his repertory over and over, Félicité replying by words that had no greater meaning, but in which she poured out her feelings. In her isolation, the parrot was almost a son, a lover. He climbed upon her fingers, pecked at her lips, clung to her shawl, and when she rocked her head to and fro like a nurse, the big wings of her cap and the wings of the bird flapped in unison. When clouds gathered on the horizon and the thunder rumbled, Loulou would scream, perhaps because he remembered the storms in his native forests. The dripping of the rain would excite him to frenzy. He flapped around, struck the ceiling with his wings, upset everything, and would finally fly into the garden to play. Then he would come back into the room, light on one of the andirons, and hop around in order to get dry. One morning, during the terrible winter of 1837, when she had put him in front of the fireplace on account of the cold, she found him dead in his cage, hanging to the wire bars with his head down. He had probably died of congestion, but she believed that he had been poisoned, and although she had no proofs whatsoever, her suspicion rested on Fabu. She wept so sorely that her mistress said, "Why don't you have him stuffed?" She asked the advice of the chemist, who had always been kind to the bird. He wrote to Havre for her. A certain man named Fellacher consented to do the work, but as the diligence driver often lost parcels entrusted to him, Félicité resolved to take her pet to Honfleur herself. Leafless apple trees lined the edges of the road. The ditches were covered with ice. The dogs on the neighbouring farms barked, and Félicité, with her hands beneath her cape, her little black sabots and her basket, trotted along nimbly in the middle of the sidewalk. She crossed the forest, passed by the Aux Chênes, and reached Saint-Gatien. Behind her, in a cloud of dust and impelled by the steep incline, a mail coach drawn by galloping horses advanced like a whirlwind. When he saw a woman in the middle of the road who did not get out of the way, the driver stood up in his seat and shouted to her, and so did the postilion, while the 4 horses, which he could not hold back, accelerated their pace. The 2 leaders were almost upon her. With a jerk of the reins he threw them to one side, but, furious at the incident, he lifted his big whip and lashed her from her head to her feet with such violence that she fell to the ground unconscious. Her first thought when she recovered her senses was to open the basket. Loulou was unharmed. She felt a sting on her right cheek. When she took her hand away, it was red, for the blood was flowing. She sat down on a pile of stones and sopped her cheek with her handkerchief. Then she ate a crust of bread she'd put in her basket and consoled herself by looking at the bird. Arriving at the top of Équemonville, she saw the